Kind girl brings homeless man home. Little did she know he's disguised vampire king. Wants only her. The storm arrived without warning, turning the peaceful evening into chaos. Rain hammered against the windows of Aria's small cottage like angry fists, and the wind howled through the trees with a sound that made her shiver. She had been preparing her simple dinner when the first flash of lightning split the sky, followed by thunder that shook the very foundations of her home. Aria pressed her face to the window, watching the storm unleash its fury. The village road had turned into a river of mud, and debris flew through the air like deadly projectiles. She had lived in this cottage for 3 years now, ever since her grandmother passed away, but she had never seen weather this violent. As another lightning bolt illuminated the landscape, something caught her eye. A dark shape lay motionless on the side of the road, barely visible through the driving rain. At first, she thought it might be a fallen branch or perhaps a sack of grain that had been blown from someone's cart. But as she squinted through the glass, the shape seemed too large, too oddly positioned. "Oh no," she whispered, her breath fogging the cold window. "That's a person." Without thinking, Aria grabbed her thick woolen cloak and pulled it over her head. She knew it was dangerous to go out in such weather, but she couldn't leave someone to die in the storm. Her grandmother had always taught her that kindness was never wasted, even when it seemed foolish to others. The moment she opened her door, the wind nearly knocked her backward. Rain struck her face like icy needles, and she had to fight against the gale to take each step forward. The muddy road sucked at her boots, threatening to pull them off with every stride. As she drew closer to the fallen figure, her heart began to race. It was indeed a man, lying face down in a puddle of muddy water. His clothes were torn and soaked through, and his long dark hair was plastered to his skull. He wasn't moving. "Sir," she called out over the storm. "Sir, can you hear me?" No response. Aria dropped to her knees beside him, not caring that the mud immediately soaked through her dress. She placed a trembling hand on his shoulder and gently rolled him over. The lightning chose that exact moment to flash again, and in that brief, brilliant moment, Aria saw his face clearly. Her breath caught in her throat. Even unconscious and battered by the storm, the man was striking. His features were sharp and aristocratic, with high cheekbones and a strong jawline. His skin was pale, almost unnaturally so, but it was his eyes that truly unsettled her. Though they were closed now, she could see the shape of them beneath his lids, eyes that seemed too large, too knowing for an ordinary face. But what disturbed her most was the strange sense of recognition she felt. She had never seen this man before in her life, she was certain of that. Yet looking at him felt like remembering a half-forgotten dream. "Please be alive," she whispered, pressing her ear to his chest. There a heartbeat, faint and slow but steady. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by determination. She couldn't carry him alone, but somehow she had to get him inside before the storm killed them both. "Sir, I need you to help me," she said loudly, shaking his shoulder more firmly. "You have to try to stand. I can't leave you out here." To her surprise, his eyes fluttered open, and Aria's world tilted. His eyes were the color of silver moonlight, pale and luminous in a way that seemed impossible. They fixed on her face with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her soul. For a moment, neither of them moved or spoke, locked in that strange electric gaze. Then his lips curved into the faintest of smiles, and when he spoke his voice was like aged whiskey, smooth, rich, and warming despite the cold. "An angel," he murmured, his words barely audible over the storm. "I didn't expect. An angel." "I'm not an angel," Aria said, though her voice came out shakier than she intended. "I'm just someone who doesn't want to watch you die in a storm. Can you stand?" He studied her for another long moment, and she had the unsettling feeling that he was memorizing every detail of her face. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I can try." Getting him to his feet was a struggle. He was taller than she had realized, easily 6 feet, and though he was lean, he was solid muscle beneath his soaked clothing. He leaned heavily on her as they made their way toward the cottage, and she could feel an odd chill emanating from his skin, as though the cold had settled deep into his very bones. By the time they reached her door, both of them were gasping from the effort. Arya's small cottage had never felt so warm and welcoming as it did when they finally stumbled inside, dripping and shivering. "Sit by the fire," she instructed, guiding him to the chair nearest the hearth. "I'll get you some dry clothes and something hot to eat." As she bustled around the cottage, gathering blankets and stoking the fire higher, she was acutely aware of his eyes following her every movement. There was something unsettling about the way he watched her. Not threatening exactly, but intensely focused, as though she were the most fascinating thing he had ever seen. The dry clothes she found were her grandfather's old things, stored in a trunk since his death 5 years ago. They fit the stranger reasonably well, though they hung loose on his lean frame. When she handed him the garments, their fingers brushed for just an instant, and she felt a strange jolt of electricity run up her arm. "Thank you," he said, and again that voice seemed to resonate through her in ways she couldn't explain. "You are very kind." "Anyone would have done the same," Arya replied, though she knew that wasn't entirely true. Many of the villagers would have been too frightened to venture out in such a storm for a stranger. While he changed into the dry clothes, she prepared a simple meal: hot soup, fresh bread, and tea brewed strong and sweet. The domestic activities helped calm her nerves, though she couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed the moment she looked into those silver eyes. When she turned back to him, now dressed and wrapped in one of her grandmother's quilts, she was struck again by how he didn't quite seem to belong in her humble cottage. Despite the simple clothing and his obvious exhaustion, there was something regal about the way he held himself, something commanding in his posture that spoke of authority and power. "What's your name?" she asked, setting the tray of food before him. "Alaric," he said simply, making no move toward the food. "Just Alaric." His smile was enigmatic. Names have power. Sometimes it's wise to share them slowly. Arya felt a chill that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. "That's an unusual way to put it." "I am an unusual man, I'm afraid," he gestured toward the food. "This smells wonderful, but I find I'm not very hungry just now. The warmth and shelter are more than enough." She frowned. The soup was hearty and the bread fresh-baked that morning, but he barely touched either. Instead, he seemed content to sit and watch her as she moved around the cottage, those strange pale eyes tracking her every gesture. "Are you from around here?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him. "I don't recognize you from the village." "I'm from far away," Alaric said carefully. "Very far away indeed. I've been traveling for a long time. Longer than you might imagine." There was something in his tone that suggested depths she couldn't fathom, stories that might take lifetimes to tell. Despite her natural curiosity, she found herself hesitant to press for details. Some instinct warned her that the answers might be more than she was prepared to hear. "Well," she said finally, "you're welcome to stay until the storm passes and you're feeling stronger. It's the least I can do." "The least you can do," he repeated softly, as though the words held special meaning. "And yet, it may be the most important thing anyone has done in centuries." Before Arya could ask what he meant by that cryptic comment, another flash of lightning illuminated the cottage, followed immediately by a crash of thunder that seemed to shake the very air around them. Alaric's head snapped toward the window, his entire body going rigid with sudden alertness. For just an instant, his eyes seemed to gleam with an inner light that was definitely not human. When he turned back to her, that commanding presence was stronger than ever, and Arya felt a flutter of something that might have been fear or anticipation. "The storm," he said quietly, "is only the beginning." Dawn broke with surprising gentleness after the violent storm. The air smelled fresh and clean, washed by the night's fury, and golden sunlight streamed through Aria's small windows. She had slept fitfully, her dreams filled with silver eyes and whispered words she couldn't quite remember upon waking. When she emerged from her bedroom, she found Alaric standing by the window, perfectly still as he gazed out at the village beyond. He hadn't moved from that spot, she realized with a start. His hair was still damp from the night before, and the blanket lay exactly where she had left it on the chair. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked softly. He turned to her with that enigmatic smile. "Sleep and I are old adversaries. I find the dawn far more interesting than dreams." There was something in the way he said "old adversaries" that made her skin prickle. Everything about this man seemed weighted with hidden meanings, as though he spoke in a language she only half understood. "Would you like to walk through the village with me?" Arya offered. "I need to check on some of the older residents after the storm, make sure they're all right." His eyes lit up with genuine interest. "I would be honored to accompany you." As they walked through the muddy streets, Arya couldn't help but notice how the villagers stared at Alaric. It wasn't just his striking appearance or unfamiliar face. There was something else in their expressions, a mixture of unease and recognition that didn't make sense. Mrs. Fletcher actually crossed herself when she saw him, muttering something under her breath about old blood returning. But it was Alaric's behavior that truly unsettled her. He moved through the village as though he had walked these streets 1,000 times before, his steps sure and confident even when the paths were hidden by storm debris. More than once he paused to examine buildings that had stood for generations, running his fingers along stone walls while murmuring words in a language she didn't recognize. "That bakery," he said suddenly, pointing to a crumbling structure that had been abandoned for decades. "It used to have the most beautiful rose garden behind it. The baker's daughter would tend it every morning before dawn, singing old songs to make the flowers grow sweeter." Arya stopped walking, staring at him in confusion. "How could you possibly know that? That bakery has been empty since before I was born. Even my grandmother barely remembered when it was still operating." Alaric's expression grew distant, as though he were seeing something far beyond the present moment. Sometimes the past speaks louder than the present, especially in places where so much joy and sorrow have mingled. They continued their walk, but Arya found herself watching him more carefully. At the old church, he stopped abruptly when the bells began to ring for morning prayers. His face went pale, paler than it already was, and he pressed a hand to his temple as though in pain. "Are you all right?" she asked, reaching out to steady him. "The bells," he said through gritted teeth. "They're louder than they used to be." "Used to be," she repeated, but he was already walking away from the church, his steps quick and purposeful. Near the village's ancient well, Alaric knelt suddenly beside a pile of stones that looked like nothing more than rubble to Arya's eyes. But as he brushed away centuries of moss and dirt, she could see the faint outline of carved symbols, worn almost smooth by time and weather. "This was a shrine once," he said softly, his fingers tracing patterns she couldn't make out. "People would come here to ask for protection from the darkness, to ward off the creatures that hunted in the night." He looked up at her, and for a moment his eyes seemed to hold depths of sadness that no mortal man should carry. "They were right to be afraid." "Alaric," Arya said carefully, "how do you know all of this? These ruins, these stories, nobody talks about them anymore. They're forgotten history." He was quiet for a long moment, still kneeling beside the ancient stones. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What if I told you that some histories are forgotten for good reason? That some stories are buried because the truth of them would terrify the living?" A chill ran down Arya's spine, and she took an involuntary step backward. "What are you saying?" Before he could answer, old Henrik the blacksmith approached them, his weathered face creased with concern. He glanced nervously at Alaric, then pulled Arya aside. "Begging your pardon, miss," Henrik whispered, "but that fellow you're with, there's something not right about him. Last night, after the storm, I saw him walking through the village. Just walking, calm as you please, while the wind was still howling fit to wake the dead. Arya's heart began to race. That's impossible. He was in my cottage all night, recovering from the storm. Henrik shook his grizzled head. Saw him with my own eyes, I did. Walking past the cemetery like he owned the place, talking to himself? Or maybe to someone I couldn't see. And Miss Henrik's voice dropped even lower. The way he moved, the way he looked. It reminded me of the old stories my grandmother used to tell. About the vampire king who ruled these lands centuries ago. Before the sorceress bound him, the blood in Arya's veins seemed to freeze. The vampire king is just a legend, Henrik. A story to frighten children. Aye, that's what we tell ourselves, Henrik agreed grimly. But legends have a way of walking among us when we least expect it. Just be careful, miss. There's old magic stirring. I can feel it in my bones. When Arya returned to Alaric, he was standing once again, brushing dirt from his hands. The ancient symbols were hidden once more beneath moss and debris, as though they had never been uncovered. Ready to continue? He asked pleasantly, but she caught something in his expression, a flicker of knowledge, as though he had heard every word of her conversation with Henrik. That night, Arya lay awake listening to the sounds outside her cottage. Sure enough, she heard footsteps on the path, slow, measured, deliberate. Through her window, she saw Alaric walking in the moonlight, his pale skin seeming to glow with its own inner radiance. He paused beneath her window and looked up, his silver eyes finding hers with uncanny accuracy. Even from a distance, she could see his lips moving, forming words she couldn't hear but somehow felt in her very soul. Names from a forgotten age drifted through her mind like whispers on the wind. Elisera, Morgrim, Valeth the Forsaken. Names that meant nothing to her conscious mind, but sent tremors of recognition through her sleeping memories. As she watched, Alaric raised one hand in what might have been a greeting or a benediction, and Arya realized with crystal clarity that whatever Henrik suspected, whatever impossible truth lay hidden beneath Alaric's mysterious exterior, she was already far too deep in its web to escape. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Father Marcus stood at Arya's door, his usually kind face drawn with worry lines that seemed to have deepened overnight. "Arya, my child," he said, glancing nervously over her shoulder into the cottage. "I've come to speak with you about your guest." "He's just a traveler who was caught in the storm, Father," she replied, though even to her own ears the words sounded hollow. "Is he?" Father Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The church bells rang strangely yesterday when he passed by. They haven't done that since. Well, since the old days. Dark days that are better left forgotten." Before Arya could respond, Alaric appeared behind her, moving with that unsettling silence she was beginning to recognize. Father Marcus took an involuntary step backward, his hand moving instinctively to the silver cross at his throat. "Good morning, Father," Alaric said pleasantly, but there was something predatory in his smile. A beautiful day after such a violent storm. The priest's face had gone pale. He mumbled something about urgent matters at the church and hurried away without another word, casting fearful glances over his shoulder. "He seems distressed," Alaric observed mildly. "Everyone in the village is on edge because of you," Arya said, turning to face him fully. "Henrik thinks you're connected to old legends. Father Marcus acts like you're the devil himself. And you," she studied his impassive features. "You act like you know exactly why they're afraid." Alaric was quiet for a long moment, those silver eyes searching her face as though looking for something specific. Finally, he sighed a sound that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. "Perhaps it's time I stayed somewhere else," he said. "I've imposed on your kindness long enough, and I wouldn't want to bring trouble to your door." "No," Arya said quickly, surprising herself with the vehemence of her response. "I mean, you're welcome to stay as long as you need. Despite everything strange about this situation, I feel I feel like you belong here somehow. Something flickered in his expression. Hope, perhaps, or relief. You are remarkable, Arya. More remarkable than you know. Later that afternoon, as they sat by the fire sharing a quiet meal that Alaric once again barely touched, Arya made a decision that would change everything. She reached into her dress and withdrew a delicate silver chain, at the end of which hung an old locket, the only thing she had left of her great-grandmother's belongings. This belonged to my family, she said softly, holding it out for him to see. My grandmother said it was very old, passed down through generations of women in our bloodline. I've never been able to open it, but sometimes I feel like it's waiting for something. The moment Alaric's eyes fell on the locket, his entire demeanor changed. The careful mask of pleasant mystery he had worn for days cracked, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. His hands began to tremble as he stared at the intricate silver crest carved into its surface, an intertwining of roses and thorns beneath a crescent moon. Where did you get this? His voice was barely a whisper, rough with an emotion she couldn't identify. I told you it's been in my family for generations. Why? Do you recognize it? Alaric's laugh was bitter and hollow. Recognize it? My dear girl, that crest haunted my dreams for 3 centuries. It's the seal of Elisera the Moonweaver, the sorceress who bound me to this cursed half-life. Arya's blood turned to ice in her veins. What are you talking about? The stories Henrik told you, the legends Father Marcus fears. They're all true. Alaric rose from his chair, beginning to pace like a caged animal. I am the vampire king of these lands, or I was, before Elisera stripped away my power and condemned me to wander as barely more than a mortal man. That's impossible, Arya whispered, but even as she said it, pieces began falling into place: his pale skin, his aversion to food and church bells, his knowledge of the village's ancient history. The binding spell was tied to her bloodline, Alaric continued, his silver eyes now blazing with intensity. As long as her descendants lived, carrying her magic in their veins, I would remain weakened, trapped between death and true life. But if one of her line were to willingly break the seal, you're saying I'm descended from this sorceress? Arya's voice cracked with disbelief. The crest proves it. The way you found me in the storm, the way you took me in without question. It wasn't kindness, Arya. It was destiny. The magic in your blood called to the curse in mine, drawing us together across impossible odds. Arya staggered backward, the locket suddenly feeling heavy as a millstone around her neck. You're insane. These are just old stories, legends that got mixed up with reality. Am I? Alaric's form seemed to shimmer for a moment, and she caught a glimpse of something else beneath his human appearance. Something ancient and powerful and terrifyingly beautiful. Look at me, truly look, and tell me I'm just a man caught in a storm. When she forced herself to meet his gaze, she saw the truth blazing there like silver fire. This was no mortal man, no simple traveler. The presence she had sensed from the beginning, the command in his bearing despite his apparent weakness. It was the remnant of a power that had once ruled the night itself. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice barely audible. Nothing you're not willing to give, he said softly, taking a careful step toward her. But I need you to understand, without you, I am trapped in this shadow existence forever. With you, with your willing cooperation, I could be whole again. And if I refuse, his expression grew infinitely sad. Then I remain as I am, and you remain safe from the darkness I once commanded. The choice, dear Arya, is entirely yours. But even as he spoke those words, they both knew that the choice had been made the moment she pulled him from that storm. The crest around her neck pulsed with warm light, responding to his presence like a key recognizing its destined lock. Outside, storm clouds were gathering again on the horizon, and with them, Arya sensed, would come others who had felt the stirring of ancient power. Others who might not be content to give her the luxury of choice. The vampire king had returned to the world, even in his weakened state. and she was the only one who could decide whether that return would mean salvation or doom. For both of them. The whispers began at sunset. Arya first noticed them as she tended her small garden behind the cottage. Voices carried on the evening wind, too distant to make out words but close enough to send chills down her spine. When she looked up from her herbs, she saw figures moving between the trees at the forest's edge, pale shapes that seemed to glide rather than walk. "They've found me," Alaric said quietly from behind her. She hadn't heard him approach, but his presence no longer startled her. If anything, she found his nearness oddly comforting as those ghostly figures prowled the tree line. "Who are they?" "Vampires who served under my rule centuries ago. Some loyal, others less so." His jaw tightened as he watched the shadows dance between the trees. When a king falls, ambitious subjects see opportunity. When he shows signs of rising again, they see threat. A bone-chilling howl echoed across the village, and several windows slammed shut in response. Arya pressed closer to Alaric, feeling the supernatural chill emanating from his skin. "What do they want?" "Some want to reclaim their place at my side when I regain full power. Others want to ensure I never do." His silver eyes reflected the dying light like mirrors. "And all of them want you, Arya. The one who holds the key to everything." That night they came. Arya woke to the sound of scratching at her windows, long deliberate scrapes that made her think of claws on glass. Through the curtains she could see shapes moving outside, circling the cottage like predators stalking wounded prey. "Stay back from the windows," Alaric commanded, his voice carrying an authority that made her obey instantly. For the first time since she'd found him, he looked truly dangerous, his pale skin almost luminescent in the darkness, his movements fluid and predatory. The front door exploded inward with a sound like thunder. 3 figures entered, and Arya's breath caught in her throat. They had once been beautiful, she could see that, but centuries of darkness had twisted them into something horrible. Their eyes burned red in the darkness, and when they smiled, their fangs gleamed like ivory daggers. "Hello, my lord," the tallest one said, her voice like honey poured over broken glass. "We've missed you terribly." "Seraphina," Alaric replied coolly. "Still as dramatic as ever, I see." The vampire called Seraphina laughed, a sound that made the windows rattle. 300 years of freedom have been educational. We've learned to live quite well without a king." "Then why are you here?" "Because rumors spread quickly in the darkness and word of your awakening has reached some very interested parties." Seraphina's burning gaze shifted to Arya, who felt like a mouse being studied by a snake. "Including those who would rather see you remain bound forever." Before anyone could react, the cottage filled with more shadows. They poured through the broken door and shattered windows like liquid darkness, taking shape as more vampires materialized from the night. Arya counted at least a dozen, their eyes gleaming with hunger and malice. "The descendant comes with us," announced a vampire with scars across his face. "The Crimson Court has decreed it." "Over my dead body," Alaric snarled, and for a moment, his weakened form seemed to flicker with the ghost of his former power. "That can be arranged," Seraphina purred. "You're barely more than mortal now, Alaric. What can you possibly do against all of us?" The battle erupted with savage fury. Alaric moved faster than human eyes could follow, his hands becoming claws that left silver trails in the air. But he was outnumbered and weakened, and soon he was thrown against the cottage wall with bone-crushing force. "Run!" he gasped to Arya as blood trickled from his mouth. "Get to the church. They can't follow you onto holy ground." But before she could move, iron-strong hands seized her arms. The scarred vampire's breath was cold against her neck as he whispered, "The court has such interesting plans for you, little sorceress." Then impossibly, the cottage door opened again. But this time it wasn't more vampires who entered. It was the villagers, led by Henrik the blacksmith and Father Marcus. They carried torches and silver weapons, their faces grim with determination. "Release her," Father Marcus commanded, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes. Serafina laughed mockingly. Mortals! How quaint! Do you really think? Her words were cut short as Henrik hurled a handful of silver dust into the air. Where it touched the vampire's skin, it burned like acid, sending several of them shrieking backward. Old traditions die hard in this village, Henrik said grimly. We remember the old ways of fighting the darkness. In the chaos that followed, Alaric struggled to his feet, his face a mask of pain and rage. Arya, he called out, extending his hand toward her. We have to go. Now. She didn't hesitate. Breaking free from the scarred vampire's loosening grip, she ran to Alaric's side. Together, they crashed through the cottage's back window as silver weapons clashed with supernatural claws behind them. They ran through the forest, branches tearing at their clothes and faces. Behind them, inhuman howls filled the night as both vampires and villagers gave chase. Enemies united in their desire to possess the one woman who could change everything. Where can we go? Arya gasped as they stumbled through the darkness. Away from here, Alaric replied, his arm strong around her waist as he half carried her over fallen logs and through streams. There are ruins deeper in the forest, places where the old magic still runs strong. They might offer some protection. As they fled through the night, Arya realized that her quiet life was over forever. Behind them lay her burning cottage and a village torn apart by supernatural war. Ahead lay only uncertainty, and the growing understanding that she was no longer just Arya the herbalist. She was the key to a power that could reshape the world. And everyone wanted to claim that key for themselves. The abandoned chapel sat like a broken crown among the ancient trees, its crumbling walls covered in moss and its stained glass windows long since shattered by time. But even in ruins it held power. Arya could feel it humming in the air like a held breath, something sacred and protective that made the shadows recoil. They had been running for 3 days, sleeping in caves and drinking from forest streams while the hunt continued around them. Arya's dress was torn and muddy, her feet blistered from walking, but it was the weight of knowledge that truly exhausted her. Every time she looked at Alaric, she saw both the man who had saved her from vampire claws and the ancient king whose awakening had brought chaos to her world. We can rest here, Alaric said softly, leading her through the chapel's broken doorway. The old consecration still holds. They can't enter holy ground. Arya sank onto a fallen stone that might once have been part of the altar, her legs finally giving out from exhaustion. How long can we hide? They'll never stop hunting us. No, he agreed quietly. They won't. As if summoned by his words, shapes began emerging from the forest around the chapel. Vampires materialized from the shadows. Some she recognized from the cottage battle. Others were new faces twisted by centuries of darkness. They formed a circle around the ruined building, their eyes glowing like embers in the twilight. Alaric! Serafina's voice rang out across the clearing. Enough games. You're trapped, weak, and outnumbered. Surrender the girl, and we might let you live long enough to remember what true power feels like. From another direction came the scarred vampire's harsh laughter. The Crimson Court grows impatient, fallen king. Our master wants the sorceress brought before him alive. What she chooses to do with her power after that, well, that will be decided for her. Alaric's hands clenched into fists, his silver eyes blazing with fury and frustration. Cowards, he called back. Too afraid to face me on equal ground. Equal ground. Serafina's mocking laughter echoed off the chapel walls. You're a shadow of what you once were. A mortal playing at being immortal. Arya watched the vampires pacing outside like wolves around a sheep pen, and felt something break inside her chest. This was her fault. Her bloodline, her existence had brought this war to innocent people. Her cottage was burned, her village terrorized, and now even this sanctuary would eventually fail. There has to be another way, she whispered. Alaric turned to her, and in his eyes she saw the weight of centuries. All the battles fought, all the power lost, all the loneliness of his cursed existence. "There is," he said quietly. "But the price. Tell me." He was silent for a long moment, as if the words themselves were too dangerous to speak. When he finally found his voice, it was barely above a whisper. "The binding can be broken, Arya. Completely broken. But it requires a willing sacrifice of blood from Elisara's line, freely given to restore what was taken." His gaze met hers, intense and desperate. "Your blood mixed with mine would shatter the spell that has held me for 3 centuries. I would regain my full power, become the vampire king in truth once more. And then I could protect you from all of them. The rival clans, the Crimson Court, anyone who would dare threaten what is mine." His voice grew stronger, more commanding. "But Arya, you must understand, the ritual would bind us together forever. Your fate would be tied to mine, your life force connected to my immortal existence. You would be neither fully human nor fully vampire, but something new. Something that has never existed before." The weight of the choice settled on her shoulders like a mountain. Outside, the vampires were growing bolder, testing the boundaries of the sacred ground. Soon, their hunger would overcome their caution. "What if you become a tyrant again?" she asked. "What if power corrupts you?" "It might," he admitted with brutal honesty. "Power has a way of changing people, even those who start with good intentions. I can't promise you that I'll be the same man you saved from that storm." "Then why should I risk it?" Alaric moved closer, kneeling before her like a suppliant before a queen. "Because in 3 centuries of darkness, you are the only light I've found. Because when I look at you, I remember what it feels like to hope. Because," his voice broke slightly, "because I love you, Arya. Not just for what you can give me, but for who you are. Your kindness, your courage, your stubborn refusal to abandon those who need help." Tears blurred her vision. "Alaric, the choice is yours," he said again, rising to his feet. "Break the seal and risk unleashing a monster, or let us both die here while the world burns around us." Outside, the vampires had begun to chant in an ancient language that made the very air vibrate with malevolent power. The chapel's protective barrier was weakening under their combined assault. Arya closed her eyes and felt for the locket at her throat. Elisara's crest, warm against her skin. In her mind, she could almost hear her ancestor's voice, speaking across the centuries. "The choice was always meant to be yours, child. Love or fear. Trust or despair. Choose wisely." When she opened her eyes, Alaric was watching her with an expression of such vulnerable hope that it took her breath away. "If I do this," she said slowly, "if I break the seal and bind myself to you forever, promise me one thing. Anything. Promise me that no matter how much power you regain, you'll remember this moment. Remember that your strength came not from conquest, but from love freely given." Alaric's smile was radiant, transforming his pale features with joy and wonder. "I swear it on whatever remains of my soul." The chapel walls shuddered as the vampire's assault intensified. Cracks appeared in the ancient stones, and cold wind began to seep through the gaps. Arya stood up, her decision made. "Then let's end this." The ritual was simpler than Arya had expected, and infinitely more profound. Alaric drew a small silver blade from his coat. Where he had been hiding it, she couldn't say, but it gleamed with ancient power in the chapel's dim light. The vampires outside had grown frenzied, their chanting reaching a fever pitch as they sensed what was about to happen. "Your blood first," Alaric said softly, offering her the blade. "It must be given willingly, with full knowledge of what you're choosing." Arya took the knife, surprised by how warm it felt in her palm. The metal seemed to pulse with life, responding to her touch like a living thing. Without hesitation, she drew the blade across her palm, watching crimson drops fall onto the cracked chapel floor. The moment her blood touched the consecrated stone, the world exploded with light. The locket at her throat blazed like a fallen star, and suddenly the chapel was filled with the ghostly figure of a woman in flowing robes. Elisera the moonweaver stood before them, her translucent form shimmering with silver radiance. "My descendant," the sorceress spoke, her voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere. "You understand what you're about to unleash?" "I understand," Arya replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I'm choosing to trust in love rather than fear." Elisara's ghostly smile was achingly sad. "Then you are wiser than I was, child. I bound him out of terror, not justice. Perhaps love can succeed where vengeance failed." The ancient sorceress turned to Alaric, and her expression grew stern. "And you, fallen king? What promises do you make?" Alaric knelt before the spirit, his head bowed in genuine reverence. "I swear by her blood and mine that I will use my restored power to protect, not to conquer, to love, not to dominate. And if I break this oath," he looked up at Arya with eyes full of wonder, "then let her be the one to destroy me." Elisera nodded slowly, then began to fade. "The binding is yours to break, granddaughter. Choose well." Outside, the chapel walls finally gave way. Vampires poured through the gaps like a tide of shadow and hunger, their eyes blazing with triumphant malice. Seraphina led the charge, her fangs bared in a savage grin. "Too late," she shrieked. "The girl is ours." But Arya was already moving. She pressed her bleeding palm to Alaric's mouth, feeling his sharp intake of breath as her blood touched his lips. The locket around her neck exploded with blinding brilliance, and power unlike anything she had ever imagined surged through her veins. The binding spell shattered like glass. Alaric's transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. His mortal disguise fell away like shed skin, revealing the true form of the vampire king. He stood 7 feet tall, his pale skin now luminous as moonlight, his silver eyes burning with the power of ages. Dark wings unfurled from his shoulders, and when he smiled, his fangs gleamed like ivory daggers. The attacking vampires stopped mid-charge, suddenly faced with their true master in all his terrible glory. "Kneel," Alaric commanded, and his voice shook the very foundations of the earth. Most of the vampires dropped to their knees instantly, overwhelmed by the raw power radiating from their restored king. But Seraphina and the scarred vampire hesitated, their faces twisted with rage and fear. "You think a few centuries of weakness have made us forget how to fight you?" Seraphina snarled. Alaric's laughter was like thunder. "I think you've forgotten what true power looks like." He moved faster than lightning, his clawed hand closing around Seraphina's throat. She had barely begun to scream before she crumbled to ash, scattered by the wind before she could draw another breath. The scarred vampire turned to flee, but Alaric's voice froze him in place. "Return to your crimson court. Tell them the vampire king has risen, and he is no longer interested in their games." The remaining vampires scattered into the night like leaves before a storm, carrying news of their masters returned to every dark corner of the world. When the chapel was finally quiet, Alaric turned back to Arya. The terrible power was still there, still blazing in his silver eyes, but something else had changed. The cold remoteness she had feared was nowhere to be found. Instead, she saw wonder, gratitude, and a love so profound it took her breath away. "How do you feel?" she asked softly. "Complete," he said simply. "For the first time in centuries, I feel complete." She could sense the change in herself too, the connection between them humming like a live wire, their life forces intertwined in ways that defied understanding. She was still human, still herself, but there was something more now, something eternal. "What happens now?" she asked. Alaric knelt before her again, this time not as a supplicant but as a king offering his crown to his queen. "Now we begin again. A new age, a new way of ruling. Not through fear, but through the power of love freely given." He took her hand in his, pressing his lips to her palm where the ritual scar was already healing. "If you'll have me, Arya. If you'll help me build something better than what came before." She looked around the ruined chapel, imagining it restored to its former glory. She thought of her village, her people, and all the others who lived in fear of the darkness. With Alaric's power and her wisdom, perhaps they could truly protect them all. Yes, she whispered, and the word echoed through the night like a promise. Let's build something beautiful together. As dawn broke over the ancient forest, the vampire king and his mortal queen stood together in the ruins of the old world, ready to create something magnificent from its ashes. The forgotten king was forgotten no more, but he had chosen love over conquest, and that choice would reshape the darkness forever.